The morning mist clung to Pearl Harbor like a shroud of deception on December 7th, 1941. Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the deck of his flagship, the USS Pennsylvania, watching the sun pierce through the Hawaiian dawn. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor would become a graveyard for American naval power. At Ford Island, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was reviewing routine patrol reports when his aide brought him coffee and the morning's intelligence briefings. The reports were mundane, nothing more threatening than scattered radio intercepts from Japanese diplomatic channels. The Navy's cryptographers had been working overtime to decode messages, but the critical intelligence that might have prevented disaster remained locked in diplomatic pouches and bureaucratic delays. 6 miles away, at Hickam Field, Technical, Sergeant William Rasmussen was conducting his pre-dawn inspection of the bomber squadron. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses sat in neat rows, their silver wings gleaming in the early light. These massive aircraft represented America's deterrent force in the Pacific, a symbol of technological superiority that would soon prove tragically vulnerable. The sailors aboard the USS Arizona were beginning their Sunday morning routine. Seaman First Class Carl Carson was writing a letter to his sweetheart in Ohio, describing the beauty of the Hawaiian sunrise and his plans for shore leave. In the ship's galley, Cook Third Class James Miller was preparing breakfast for over 1,400 crew members, unaware that many would never taste another meal. Meanwhile, 300 miles north of Oahu, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, the Japanese strike force, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers and their escorts, had maintained radio silence for 12 days while crossing the North Pacific. Operation Z, as the Japanese called their attack plan, was entering its final phase. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leader of the aerial assault force, was conducting final briefings with his pilots. The young aviators listened intently as Fukuda outlined their targets: Battleship Row, the aircraft carriers if present, and the fuel storage facilities. Each pilot knew his role in what would become one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. At Pearl Harbor's Intelligence Center, Lieutenant Joseph Lockhart was monitoring the new SCR-270 radar installation at Opana Point. The experimental technology had been tracking aircraft movements for weeks, but this Sunday morning would test its operators in ways they never imagined. The radar screen showed only routine air traffic, commercial flights, and training missions. That painted a picture of peaceful normalcy. Admiral Kimmel's staff had received various intelligence reports about Japanese fleet movements, but the information was fragmented and often contradictory. The diplomatic negotiations in Washington between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura continued, giving false hope that war might still be avoided through peaceful means. In the enlisted quarters of the USS West Virginia, Seaman Second Class Donald Stratton was polishing brass fittings while his shipmates discussed weekend plans. The massive battleship, commissioned in 1923, was a floating city of over 1,500 men. Her 16-inch guns could hurl shells over 20 miles. But on this peaceful Sunday morning, those weapons remained silent and unloaded. As the clock approached 7:30, Pearl Harbor maintained its deceptive calm. Church services were preparing to begin on many ships, and the traditional Sunday morning inspection routines were underway. The American Pacific Fleet, anchor of naval power in the Pacific, rested securely in what military planners considered an impregnable fortress. Within minutes, this illusion of safety would be shattered forever, transforming a quiet Hawaiian morning into a date that would live in infamy. At exactly 7:49 a.m., the tranquility of Pearl Harbor exploded into chaos. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was reviewing flight schedules when the first Japanese dive bomber screamed overhead, its red rising sun insignia clearly visible against the pale morning sky. The distinctive whine of the Aichi D-3 Aval dive bomber was unlike anything American ears had heard before in these peaceful waters. Seaman First Class Carl Carson aboard the USS Arizona looked up from his letter as explosions began erupting across Ford Island. Initially, many sailors believed they were witnessing an unusually realistic training exercise. Carson's confusion turned to horror as he watched a torpedo bomber release its deadly payload directly toward Battleship Row, the modified 16-inch naval shell, converted into an aerial torpedo specifically for Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, streaked through the morning air with lethal precision. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the first wave of 183 aircraft, transmitted the coded message that would seal Pearl Harbor's fate. Tora, Tora, Tora. The Japanese phrase meaning tiger signaled to Admiral Nagumo that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Flying at an altitude of 3,000 feet in his Nakajima B-5N Cape bomber, Fukuda surveyed the target-rich environment below with professional satisfaction. At the radar station on Opana Point, Private Joseph Lockard watched in disbelief as his screen filled with aircraft signatures approaching from the northwest. He had detected the incoming formation at 7:02 a.m., estimating over 50 aircraft at a distance of 132 miles. When Lockard reported the contact to Fort Shafter, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler dismissed the reading, assuming the blips represented a scheduled flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, became the first battleship to suffer catastrophic damage. Torpedo bombers from the carriers Hiryu and Soryu attacked the vessel's port side with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, 3 torpedoes had torn massive holes in the Oklahoma's hull. Below the waterline, Seaman Second Class Stephen Young felt the ship shudder beneath his feet as thousands of tons of seawater rushed into the breached compartments. Technical Sergeant William Rasmussen at Hickam Field watched in horror as Japanese fighters strafed his precious B-17 bombers. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, swept across the airfield at treetop level, their machine guns chattering death. The American aircraft, parked in neat rows for easy maintenance, became sitting ducks for the marauding Japanese pilots aboard the USS Arizona. General quarters sounded at 7:55 a.m., but it was already too late. High-level bombers from the carriers Kaga and Akagi had targeted the mighty battleship for destruction. At 8:06 a.m., a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, dropped from 10,000 feet by a Nakajima B-5N, penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The resulting explosion lifted the 32,000-ton vessel partially out of the water and broke her back. Seaman First Class Carl Carson, who had been writing to his sweetheart moments earlier, was among the 1,107 men killed instantly when the Arizona's forward magazines detonated. The explosion created a fireball that rose over 1,000 feet into the Hawaiian sky, visible from 20 miles away. Cook Third Class James Miller, preparing breakfast in the galley, vanished along with most of the ship's crew in that terrible moment. The USS West Virginia, where Seaman Second Class Donald Stratton had been polishing brass, sustained 6 torpedo hits on her port side. Captain Mervyn Benyon, mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb hit on the nearby USS Tennessee, continued directing damage control efforts until his death. Stratton, severely burned but alive, began the heroic task of helping wounded shipmates escape the burning vessel. Admiral Husband Kimmel, watching the attack from his headquarters, stood frozen in disbelief as his Pacific Fleet died before his eyes. A spent .50 caliber bullet shattered the window behind him, leaving a small hole in his white uniform jacket. Later, Kimmel would ruefully observe that the bullet had missed, giving him a Purple Heart by just a few inches. As the first wave concluded, at 8:25 a.m., Pearl Harbor resembled a vision of hell. Black smoke billowed from burning ships, and the harbor's surface was covered with oil, debris, and bodies. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise beyond their wildest expectations. But Commander Fukuda knew this was only the beginning. The second wave was already forming up for another devastating attack. As the smoke from the first wave's devastation darkened the Hawaiian sky, Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. Unlike the torpedo bombers and fighters of the first assault, this formation consisted primarily of Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, designed to finish what their predecessors had begun. The time was 8:54 a.m., and Pearl Harbor's defenders were finally beginning to mount organized resistance. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Welch had managed to reach Haliwa Field during the first attack, where they commandeered the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. These two Army Air Forces pilots would become among the few American aviators to engage the enemy that morning, shooting down several Japanese aircraft in desperate aerial combat over the burning harbor. Their P-40 fighters, though outnumbered, proved that American fighting spirit remained unbroken despite the surprise attack. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a prime target for the second wave. Bombers Ensign Joseph Taussig, despite a severed leg, continued directing the ship's anti-aircraft batteries as Japanese pilots concentrated their attacks on the moving vessel. The Nevada's attempt to escape Pearl Harbor created both hope and terror among the defenders, as her potential sinking in the harbor channel would have blocked the entire naval base. According to historical records from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the USS Pennsylvania, Admiral Kimmel's flagship, was attacked while in dry dock alongside the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. Japanese dive bombers scored direct hits on both destroyers, causing massive explosions that completely destroyed the Downs and left the Cassin a burned-out hulk. The Pennsylvania, though damaged, remained operational and would later participate in the Pacific War's revenge campaigns. Seaman Second Class Donald Stratton, severely burned on the West Virginia, witnessed extraordinary heroism as his shipmates fought to save lives amid the chaos. Chief Petty Officer John Harper organized firefighting efforts while Lieutenant Claude Ricketts coordinated the ship's damage control. The West Virginia's crew demonstrated the courage and professionalism that would characterize American naval forces throughout the coming war. At Hickam Field, Technical Sergeant William Rasmussen watched as Japanese fighters continued strafing American aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0s, flown by experienced pilots from the carrier Zuikaku, destroyed dozens of bombers and fighters on the ground. Master Sergeant Emil Kane organized ground crews to push undamaged aircraft to safety while machine gun bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. The hospital ship USS Solace, clearly marked with red crosses, became a refuge for wounded sailors pulled from burning vessels. Hospital Corpsman Third Class Robert Bollins worked tirelessly to treat burn victims and trauma cases as the ship's medical facilities were overwhelmed by casualties. The Solace's doctors performed surgery under combat conditions, saving hundreds of lives during the attack. Commander Cassin Young of the USS Vestal demonstrated exceptional leadership when his repair ship, moored alongside the Arizona, was severely damaged by the battleship's explosion. Despite being knocked unconscious and blown overboard, Young swam back to his ship and organized efforts to beach the Vestal, preventing her from sinking and blocking the harbor channel. At Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, civilian workers and military personnel fought desperately to prevent Japanese bombers from destroying the massive oil tanks. Chief Machinist Mate Robert Scott organized firefighting teams, while Ensign William Ellis directed damage control efforts. The preservation of these fuel supplies would prove crucial to America's eventual victory in the Pacific, as their destruction would have crippled naval operations for months. The second wave attack intensified around 9:15 a.m. as dive bombers targeted ships that had escaped serious damage during the first assault. The USS Maryland, protected by the Oklahoma's hulk, suffered bomb damage but remained afloat. The USS Tennessee, trapped between Ford Island and the burning West Virginia, endured bomb hits and fires but survived to fight another day. As the second wave concluded at 9:45 a.m., Pearl Harbor had been transformed into a scene of unprecedented devastation. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, 3 cruisers were destroyed, 3 destroyers were lost, and nearly 200 aircraft had been eliminated. More tragically, over 2,400 Americans had been killed, with another 1,100 wounded. The attack's conclusion brought an eerie silence broken only by the crackling of fires and the cries of wounded men. Admiral Kimmel surveyed the destruction from his headquarters, knowing that his career was over, but more importantly recognizing that America had been thrust into a world war for which it was unprepared. In the aftermath of the second wave's devastation, Pearl Harbor became a proving ground for American courage and determination. As Japanese aircraft disappeared into the western sky, survivors emerged from the smoke and chaos to perform acts of heroism that would define the American spirit throughout the coming war. The time was 10:15 a.m., and while the immediate danger had passed, the real battle for survival had just begun. Seaman First Class Joe George of the USS Vestal had been blown into the harbor during the Arizona's explosion. Despite severe burns covering 60% of his body, George swam through flaming oil to reach the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma. There, he joined a desperate rescue effort to free sailors trapped inside the capsized battleship, using cutting torches and sledgehammers. George and other volunteers worked for hours to breach the Oklahoma's hull, ultimately saving 32 men from certain death. Hospital Corpsman First Class John Hamill aboard the USS Nevada continued treating wounded sailors, even as Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attacks on his ship. when shrapnel from a near miss tore through his left arm. Hamill refused medical attention and continued applying tourniquets and bandaging wounds. His medical bag exhausted, Hamill tore strips from his own uniform to create makeshift bandages for his shipmates. At Ford Island's dispensary, Lieutenant Ruth Erickson became one of the first Navy nurses to treat combat casualties on American soil, working without adequate supplies or proper facilities. Erickson organized triage procedures while Japanese aircraft continued their attacks overhead. She later recalled treating sailors with burns so severe that their dog tags had melted into their skin, yet maintaining professional composure throughout the ordeal. Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn at Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station demonstrated exceptional valor by manning a .50 caliber machine gun despite multiple wounds. When Japanese fighters strafed his position, Finn continued firing at the attacking aircraft while blood flowed from shrapnel wounds in his chest and arms. His accurate gunfire helped drive off several enemy fighters, protecting his airfields, remaining aircraft, and personnel. The story of Ensign Francis Flaherty and Seaman First Class James Ward aboard the USS Oklahoma exemplifies the selfless courage displayed throughout Pearl Harbor that morning. When the battleship began capsizing, both men remained at their posts in a lower turret, ensuring that their shipmates could escape through the only available hatch. Neither man survived, but their sacrifice saved dozens of lives. Mess attendant, third-class Doris Miller aboard the USS West Virginia, became one of the attack's most celebrated heroes despite facing racial segregation that typically relegated African-American sailors to non-combat roles. When his battle station was destroyed, Miller helped carry wounded officers to safety, then manned an unfamiliar .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. Though untrained on the weapon, Miller fired at attacking Japanese aircraft until his ammunition was exhausted. At Hickam Field, Staff Sergeant William Fountain organized civilian construction workers to fight fires and rescue injured personnel. When a Japanese fighter strafed the fire truck Fountain was driving, he continued toward a burning hangar where several airmen were trapped. Fountain's truck was hit multiple times, but he successfully evacuated 12 wounded men before the hangar's ammunition stores exploded. The crew of the harbor tug USS Hoga demonstrated remarkable heroism by steaming directly into Pearl Harbor's burning oil slicks to rescue survivors. Chief Boatswain's Mate George Walters directed the small vessel through walls of flame to reach sailors floating in the water. The Hoga's crew pulled dozens of men from certain death, their small tugboat becoming a beacon of hope in the harbor's darkness. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg of the USS Arizona continued commanding his ship even after sustaining mortal wounds from the forward magazine explosion. Witnesses reported seeing Van Valkenburg on the bridge, attempting to coordinate damage control efforts until the ship's final moments. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership under fire. At Pearl Harbor Submarine Base, Commander Jesse Hull organized civilian workers and military personnel to establish emergency medical stations, using improvised stretchers made from doors and curtains. Hull's volunteers transported hundreds of wounded men to safety. His leadership prevented panic among civilian workers, while ensuring that military casualties received prompt medical attention. The USS Maryland's crew, though their ship suffered bomb damage, immediately began rescue operations for sailors trapped aboard the capsized Oklahoma. Chief Gunner's Mate Alvin Kernan organized cutting parties that worked throughout the day to free survivors from the battleship's hull. These rescue efforts continued for 3 days, with volunteers working in shifts round the clock. As December 7th afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor, the full magnitude of American heroism became apparent. Despite being caught completely by surprise, American servicemen and civilians had responded with courage, determination, and selfless sacrifice that would characterize the nation's response throughout the coming war. As the sun reached its zenith over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the true scope of the Japanese attack became horrifyingly clear. Admiral Husband Kimmel walked among the wreckage of his once mighty Pacific Fleet, surveying destruction that exceeded the worst nightmares of American military planners. The harbor that had symbolized American naval power in the Pacific now resembled a maritime graveyard, its waters dark with oil and debris. The battleship USS Arizona, once the pride of the Pacific Fleet, lay broken and burning at her mooring. Of her crew of 1,512 men, only 335 survived the catastrophic magazine explosion that tore her apart. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, both killed in the blast, would be among 49 recipients of the Medal of Honor for actions during the Pearl Harbor attack. The Arizona's destruction alone accounted for nearly half of the day's American casualties. The USS Oklahoma presented an equally tragic sight, her massive hull rolled completely over. Trapping hundreds of sailors inside, rescue crews worked frantically, with cutting torches and pneumatic hammers to reach survivors trapped in air pockets. Within the capsized battleship, Chief Carpenter John Austin led one rescue team that saved 29 men from the Oklahoma's hull, but over 400 sailors perished when the 30-1,000-ton vessel rolled over in just 12 minutes. Seaman Second Class Donald Stratton, despite suffering severe burns on the West Virginia, helped establish the casualty count that would shock America. The West Virginia had sustained 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb strikes, killing 106 men and wounding 52 others. Captain Mervyn Benyon, mortally wounded while directing his ship's defense, became a symbol of American naval leadership. Under fire at Ford Island and Hickam Field, the destruction of American air power was nearly complete. Technical Sergeant William Rasmussen surveyed the wreckage of his bomber squadron, finding only twisted metal where proud B-17 flying fortresses had stood hours earlier. Of the Army Air Force's 231 aircraft in Hawaii, 164 were destroyed and 6 to 7 damaged. The Navy lost 92 aircraft. With 31 damaged, the human cost of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military casualties. Lieutenant Ruth Erickson worked tirelessly in makeshift medical facilities, treating civilians caught in the crossfire of war. 68 civilians died during the attack, including several killed by American anti-aircraft shells that failed to detonate in the air. These innocent victims reminded everyone that Pearl Harbor had brought war to American soil for the first time since 1812. Commander Logan Ramsey compiled preliminary damage reports that painted a grim picture of American naval losses. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, representing the backbone of Pacific Fleet offensive power. 3 light cruisers were destroyed, along with 3 destroyers and 1 mine layer. The USS Utah, serving as a target ship, capsized with the loss of 58 lives, including Chief Water Tender John Vossen, who remained at his post to ensure boiler safety. The strategic implications of Pearl Harbor's destruction were immediately apparent to military planners in Washington. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, received reports indicating that America's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific had been crippled. The loss of battleship firepower meant that any response to Japanese aggression would be delayed for months while the fleet rebuilt its strength. However, several factors would prove crucial to America's eventual recovery and victory. The Japanese attack had missed Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, containing over 4 million barrels of oil essential for naval operations. Commander Joseph Rochford's intelligence unit, though surprised by the attack's timing, remained intact and would later provide critical intelligence for American victories at Coral Sea and Midway. Most significantly, America's aircraft carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack. The USS Enterprise, under Admiral William Halsey, was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway Island, while the USS Saratoga was undergoing maintenance in California. These 3 carriers would form the nucleus of America's Pacific offensive capability. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor resonated far beyond military casualties and material losses. News correspondent Edward Murrow would later report that the attack had transformed American public opinion overnight, ending isolationist sentiment and uniting the nation for war. President Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress the following day, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy, crystallized American determination to achieve total victory. As December 7th's evening approached, casualty reports continued mounting. Final tallies would show 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese losses were remarkably light: 29 aircraft shot down, 5 midget submarines sunk, and fewer than 100 casualties among the attack force. The count of devastation at Pearl Harbor represented more than numbers on casualty reports. It marked the end of American isolationism and the beginning of a global conflict that would reshape the 20th century. From the burning waters of Pearl Harbor would rise an American determination that would ultimately lead to victory in the Pacific and the restoration of American naval supremacy. 300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his strike aircraft return from their devastating mission. The Japanese task force, designated Kido Butai, had achieved tactical surprise beyond the most optimistic expectations of the Imperial Japanese Navy's planners. Yet even as victory reports flooded the flagship's radio room, critical decisions were being made that would ultimately contribute to Japan's defeat in the Pacific War. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, landing aboard the Akagi after leading both attack waves, immediately sought an audience with Admiral Nagumo. Fukuda's preliminary assessment indicated complete success in neutralizing American battleship power, but he urgently recommended a third-wave attack to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair installations. These targets, largely untouched during the morning's assault, represented the infrastructure necessary for American naval recovery. Captain Minoru Genda, principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, supported Fukuda's recommendation for continued strikes. Genda's analysis, based on aerial reconnaissance photographs, showed that while American battleships had been destroyed or severely damaged, the harbor's strategic facilities remained intact. The destruction of fuel tanks containing over 4 million barrels of oil would cripple American operations for months, potentially extending Japanese operational freedom throughout the Pacific. However, Admiral Nagumo faced conflicting pressures that would influence his fateful decision to withdraw. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the escort forces, reported that American submarines might be converging on the task force's position. Intelligence intercepts suggested that American aircraft carriers, unlocated during the attack, could be positioning for counter-strikes against the Japanese fleet. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on Japanese minds as well. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, leader of the torpedo bomber squadrons, reported the loss of several experienced pilots whose training had taken years to complete. Each Japanese aviator represented a significant investment in time and resources that the Imperial Japanese Navy could ill afford to lose in extended operations. According to historical documentation from the Japanese Defense Ministry archives, Emperor Hirohito had received preliminary reports of Pearl Harbor's success by noon Tokyo time. On December 8th, the Emperor's reaction was reportedly subdued, as he understood that attacking Pearl Harbor meant Japan had chosen war. With a nation possessing vastly superior industrial capacity, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo celebrated the tactical victory while privately worrying about America's potential for sustained warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor strategy, remained aboard his flagship Nagato in Japanese waters, awaiting complete battle reports. Yamamoto had conceived the Pearl Harbor attack as a means of buying time for Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, hoping that a decisive blow against American naval power would discourage prolonged American resistance. His famous prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months proved remarkably accurate. The success of Japanese intelligence gathering became apparent as damage assessment reports reached Tokyo. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nato's spy network in Hawaii had provided accurate information about American ship movements and defensive preparations. This intelligence coup enabled Japanese planners to time their attack for maximum effect. Catching the Pacific Fleet concentrated and unprepared, Captain Tomeichi Hara, commanding destroyer forces with the task force, observed that Japanese success at Pearl Harbor created dangerous overconfidence among naval officers. The ease with which American defenses had been penetrated led many Japanese commanders to underestimate American fighting capability and industrial potential. This victory disease would plague Japanese strategic thinking throughout the early war years. The technical achievements of the Pearl Harbor attack force were remarkable by any military standard. Japanese torpedo bombers had successfully adapted their weapons for Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, modifying standard aerial torpedoes to run at depths of less than 40 feet. The conversion of 16-inch naval shells into armor-piercing bombs, DEMONST, are ADED Japanese innovation and attention to detail. Admiral Nagumo's decision to withdraw after 2 attack waves would be debated by military historians for decades. His primary concern focused on preserving the carrier task force for future operations, recognizing that Japan's 6 fleet carriers represented irreplaceable strategic assets. The loss of even one carrier to American counterattack could jeopardize Japanese plans for expansion throughout the Pacific. Commander Fukuda's final report to Admiral Nagumo emphasized both Japanese achievements and missed opportunities. While American battleship power had been eliminated, the attack had failed to locate and destroy American aircraft carriers. More critically, Pearl Harbor's infrastructure remained largely intact, providing the foundation for rapid American naval recovery. As the Kido Butai turned westward toward Japan, radio intercepts revealed the full extent of American shock and outrage. President Roosevelt's address to Congress, broadcast throughout the Pacific, demonstrated that Pearl Harbor had unified rather than demoralized the American people. Japanese intelligence analysts realized that instead of discouraging American resistance, the attack had guaranteed a prolonged and bitter war. The Japanese withdrawal from Pearl Harbor marked both the high point of early Japanese success and the beginning of strategic errors that would ultimately lead to defeat. By failing to conduct follow-up attacks against Pearl Harbor's infrastructure and missing the opportunity to destroy American aircraft carriers, Japan had achieved a tactical victory that ensured strategic defeat. As December 8th dawned over Pearl Harbor, the smoke-blackened waters reflected a nation transformed. The surprise attack that had caught America sleeping had awakened a sleeping giant, whose industrial might and fighting spirit would ultimately prove unstoppable. Admiral Chester Nimitz, soon to replace Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, would later observe that Pearl Harbor had done everything for America that could have been done, except lose the war. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's address to a joint session of Congress on December 8th electrified the American people with words that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Within hours, Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote, ending America's isolationist stance and committing the nation to global conflict. The heroes of Pearl Harbor became symbols of American resilience and determination. Mess Attendant, 3rd Class Doris Miller, the first African American to receive the Navy Cross, represented the democratic ideals for which America would fight. His courage in manning an anti-aircraft gun, despite racial barriers, demonstrated that heroism transcended the prejudices of the era. Miller's story inspired countless Americans to join the war effort, contributing to ultimate victory in the Pacific. Seaman 2nd Class Donald Stratton, severely burned on the West Virginia, embodied the spirit of survival that characterized Pearl Harbor's defenders. Despite burns covering over 60% of his body, Stratton recovered and returned to active duty, serving aboard the USS Stack during subsequent Pacific operations. His memoir would later preserve the memory of shipmates who died on December 7th, ensuring their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor's attack paradoxically favored American victory. In the long term, Japan's failure to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel facilities, dry docks, and submarine base provided the infrastructure for rapid American naval recovery. Within 6 months, the harbor buzzed with reconstruction activity as damaged ships were repaired, and new vessels arrived from mainland shipyards. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack, became the foundation of American carrier aviation that would dominate the Pacific War. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Enterprise Task Force, would lead these carriers and strikes against Japanese positions, beginning America's offensive operations in the Pacific. The absence of these carriers from Pearl Harbor proved fortuitous for American war plans. Intelligence operations, largely unaffected by the Pearl Harbor attack, provided crucial advantages in subsequent naval battles. Commander Joseph Rochfort's cryptographic unit at Pearl Harbor continued breaking Japanese naval codes, providing intelligence that enabled American victories at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the decisive Battle of Midway. These intelligence coups directly avenged Pearl Harbor's surprise attack. The industrial mobilization triggered by Pearl Harbor transformed America into the arsenal of democracy. Shipyards that had built one vessel per month before the war soon launched one ship per day. The Boeing Aircraft Company, whose B-17 flying fortresses had been destroyed at Hickam Field, increased production from 38 aircraft in 1941 to over 8,000 in 1940. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Inspired partly by Pearl Harbor's example of civilian sacrifice, Rosie, the Riveter, became a symbol of American home front determination as women built the ships, aircraft, and weapons that would carry the war to Japan's home islands. The attack that had killed civilians at Pearl Harbor mobilized an entire nation for total warfare. Technical innovations accelerated by Pearl Harbor's lessons revolutionized naval warfare. Radar technology, primitive during the attack, evolved into sophisticated systems that gave American forces decisive advantages in later battles. The development of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, inspired by Pearl Harbor's defensive failures, provided American ships with unprecedented protection against aerial attack. The human cost of Pearl Harbor continued resonating throughout the war as families received notification of loved ones' deaths. However, these sacrifices strengthened rather than weakened American resolve. Gold Star families became symbols of national sacrifice, while Pearl Harbor survivors carried their fallen comrades' memory into every subsequent battle against Japanese forces. By war's end in August 1945, Pearl Harbor's strategic significance had been completely reversed. The harbor that had been America's most devastating defeat became the staging area for Japan's ultimate surrender. Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet, rebuilt from Pearl Harbor's ashes, had driven Japanese forces back to their home islands and forced unconditional surrender. The lessons of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military strategy, teaching America the dangers of isolationism and the necessity of constant vigilance. The surprise attack demonstrated that geography could no longer protect America from global conflicts, establishing the foundation for America's post-war role as a global superpower. Committed to defending democratic values worldwide, the USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, preserves Pearl Harbor's memory for future generations. Oil still seeps from the battleship's hull, creating rainbow patterns on the harbor's surface that visitors call the tears of the Arizona. These tears remind Americans that freedom's price requires eternal vigilance and that the sacrifice of December 7, 1941, must never be forgotten. From Pearl Harbor's infamy emerged America's greatest generation, forged in the crucible of surprise attack and tempered by 4 years of global warfare. Their victory over tyranny and oppression validated the democratic principles for which Pearl Harbor's defenders had died, ensuring that December 7th would indeed live in infamy as the day America awakened to its destiny as the world's defender of freedom.